To me, one of my favorite parts of history is when a group of people or a person is so up against the odds and overcomes it anyway that no matter how atheist you are, you sort of just have to throw back your hands and say, well, I guess God willed it. And one of these times when God most certainly willed it is the First Crusade. Now, in the modern day, most people don't know anything about history, and the only time crusades are ever talked about are as an example of how evil Christians are. But let's actually learn about the First Crusade and follow the life of perhaps one of the most metal men in all of history, Fulcher of Chartres. Now, the first thing to understanding Crusade history is understanding the context of the world that they were living in. From the perspective of late 11th century Christians, since the founding of Islam, it had been constantly conquering and attacking Christian kingdoms. Territories such as Egypt, North Africa, Spain, the Middle East, modern-day Turkey or Anatolia, were areas of majority Christian populations which had been conquered and were being converted to Islam. And this isn't just people or kingdoms which are being conquered, but in the control of Muslims was also the holy sees of Christianity. Jerusalem itself in the hands of Muslims, Antioch, Alexandria. From their perspective, these were Christian holy sites, the land of the apostles, which had been taken. Not only taken, but also being defiled actively. In addition to this, Christians had many rites and rituals which required pilgrimage to these holy sites. In many famous accounts, such as the Anglo-Saxon pilgrim Ceolwulf, he describes the port city of Jaffa road to Jerusalem being absolutely littered with the corpses of Christians trying to make pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Many of the conquered territories in the East were previously controlled by the Eastern Roman Empire, which is now referred to by historians as the Byzantine Empire. Now, they were Orthodox, so they weren't the right Christians, but they were still Christians. And in the last few hundred years leading up to 1099, they had been under constant invasion from Turkish Muslims, which recently were growing in ferocity and frequency. Constantinople, the city of Christianity, was at threat from the Muslim hordes. But all of the issues of the day were not only exterior. The interior of Christendom was rotting as well. Christian Europe was ruled by many different kings and counts and dukes, and while these kings and dukes and counts were supposed to be ruling with the law of God, in practice many of them were committing tyrannies against the people that they ruled and waging war for greed and vengeance rather than justice. So at this point, the popes, they're pretty pissed, dude. And Pope Urban II calls forward the Council of Clermont, where he decries the treacheries against Christendom and calls for holy war. What is forgotten is that this council calling for a crusade is not just about war. This council also saw the establishment of the peace and truce of God, which would be an end to Christian brother wars. No longer should Christian fight against Christian for the purpose of greed or vengeance, but rather they should unite in fealty under God. Council of Clermont was attended by many priests as well as very notable knights of Francia. Francia, which is modern-day France. Fulcher was one of those French priests. Fulcher, the other priests, knights, and princes would then undertake the First Crusade. Now, the first obstacle is obviously how do we get to the Holy Land? So the Frankish Crusaders formed a pact with the Eastern Roman Emperor, Alexios. The idea of the pact is that in return for military support, logistical support, and transportation, the Crusaders would assist the Eastern Romans in reclaiming the land that the Muslims had conquered. And at first, this was going well. They were going all across Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, and reclaiming land for the Eastern Romans. After the initial success, however, begins the absolute bad luck of the Crusaders. The Crusaders made their way to Antioch to besiege it. Now, the Crusaders thought that this was going to be a really quick thing. They were just going to hit it in and out. But the issue is that the Eastern Roman Emperor was sort of dragging his feet to come and help them. So it was essentially just a bunch of Franks there undersupplied, and the siege ended up lasting well over a year. And the siege was horrible. It was hot. There was no water. There was no food. People were eating their horses. People were scounging anything they could to eat or drink. It was so bad that some of the Crusaders began to flee back to France. One of these Crusaders was Stephen of Blois. Stephen of Blois, on his way back to Francia, decided to stay a few days in the court of Alexios Komnenos, where he told the emperor how hopeless the situation was, and Alexios said, packs off, dude. The Crusaders were now truly on their own. If you'll allow a tangent on Stephen of Blois, it's actually kind of a funny story. But by the time he's gotten back, the Crusaders had already taken Jerusalem. And word had actually traveled faster than Stephen of Blois. So when he got back, his wife had thought that he was a rich man now in the East, but in actuality he had cowardly ran from battle at the first sign of failure. And for the next 2 years, she nagged him and publicly shamed him so much that he went on another crusade. This is the Crusade of 1101, which isn't recognized as the Second Crusade. It was just sort of trying to capitalize on the success of the First Crusade, but it was a massive failure. Though he still survived the Crusade of 1101, even though his entire army was destroyed, he refused to leave the Holy Land because he knew how horrible his wife would be when he got back home. So he went to Jerusalem and ended up dying in battle. It was a heroic battle, it was a great one, but our boy Fulcher of Chartres comments on his death not very fondly, saying, finally he was honorable enough to die in battle. What's really messed up is he was a noble, right? He was coming from an honorable line. And so in some of the sources, he ended up stealing a lot of the credit of a real true badass who, when was completely surrounded by Muslims, ended up killing 12 of them single-handedly. And the Muslims were kind of like, whoa, dude, you're like such a fucking badass. We don't want to kill you. Do you just want to surrender and like, we'll just ransom you off? And this guy was like, nah, dude. Fucking kill me. Anyway, after a grueling year-long siege, the Crusaders finally managed to breach and take over Antioch. And immediately thereafter, a completely fresh and new army of Turks besieged them. And since the Crusaders had just taken the city of Antioch was completely out of food and water as well. So they were still starving to death. So they were still starving, but now they were also surrounded and trapped in Antioch by a completely resupplied and fresh army. Well, this is even worse than before. So after a few days of this, essentially all hope was lost. They knew that they were screwed and there was no way out without being killed. Until a mystic priest heard word from St. Peter that actually the Holy Lance which pierced the side of Jesus was buried under a church in Antioch. And sure enough, after receiving this vision, they excavated the church and found the Holy Lance. And they were so pumped that the starving, wounded Crusaders ran out of Antioch and charged headfirst into the Muslim army, which completely outnumbered them. And they fucking won, easily. After this victory, the Crusaders then continued their march to Jerusalem. A bunch of other victories happened, Edessa, that sort of thing. It's not too important. By the time they get to Jerusalem, the Muslims have started to take this very seriously. Up until this point, they sort of thought that they were just a bunch of idiots who were coming to die, but now they had just sort of lost to them like 100 times in a row. Around the city of Jerusalem, they cut down every single tree, and they poisoned every single well, and they slaughtered all the animals. So the Crusaders, now over 2 years into their journey, had no one resupplying them, had no way to build siege engines since all the trees were destroyed, and once again found themselves starving and dying of thirst. They have had no means of resupply. At this point, they're screwed. They're done. Until, in a holy vision, one of their dead comrades comes to speak to them in a dream and tells them that the reason for their misfortune is because they got too greedy. They didn't respect God enough, and that their fortunes would be reversed by getting God back on their side. So they needed to remove their armor, remove their shoes, and in the hot Middle Eastern sand, walk 3 times around the entire perimeter of the city of Jerusalem while chanting holy psalms and praising God, and the city would fall to them. So, I mean, they fucking did it, dude. And immediately after, Italian merchant ships sent by the Pope to resupply them arrived on the shores of Jerusalem. They had food, they had water, they had horses. The Crusaders then dragged the boats onto the shore, deconstructed them, and used the wood to make siege towers to siege Jerusalem. And they won. They took the city, and they killed everyone inside. Fulcher talks a lot in his chronicle about just how smug the Muslims were on the walls as they were doing their chanting, yelling, "Where is your God now?" Well, there he is! The Muslim defenders of the city retreated into the Holy Temple of Solomon to have a final stand. In this one holy temple, 10,000 people took refuge in this temple and attempted to hold out against the Crusaders. And they lost. Here's where Fulcher of Chartres says perhaps the most metal thing I've ever read in a primary source document. I'm just gonna read it flat, because it's so fucking badass. He's fucking hardcore, dude. In this temple, almost 10,000 were killed. And indeed, let it be known, if you were there, you would have seen our feet colored to the ankles with the blood of the slain. What more should I say? None were spared.
For the might of the Lord, for the home of the holy, for the faith, for the way of the